Here is a sentence that should not make sense. In the year 1930, with the world economy already bleeding out from the worst crash in its history, the United States Congress passed a law that raised taxes on more than 20,000 imported goods. Over 1,000 economists signed a public letter begging the president not to sign it. He signed it anyway. Within 2 years, world trade had collapsed by roughly 2/3. American exports fell to a fraction of what they had been. Factories closed on every continent. And in Germany, a country already suffocating under debt it could never repay, unemployment exploded until 1 in 4 workers had no job at all. Now here is the part that should stop you cold. In the elections just before that catastrophe, the Nazi Party had won less than 3% of the German vote. They were a fringe of cranks and street thugs that respectable people laughed at. 4 years later, they were the largest party in the German parliament, and Adolf Hitler was chancellor. Nobody planned that. No banker sat in a dark room and drew it up. And that is precisely the point, because the deadliest war in human history was not simply summoned into being by one evil man. It was built, brick by brick, out of debt, out of tariffs, out of reckless lending and cowardly diplomacy and short-term profit taken by people who could see exactly where it was heading and looked away anyway. The war did not begin in 1939 when the tanks rolled into Poland. It began 20 years earlier, in the gilded conference rooms of Paris, and it was financed on the trading floors of New York. Let me show you how. Go back to the end of 1918. The guns have gone silent. Europe is a graveyard, something like 17 million people dead, entire cities reduced to rubble, the economies of Britain and France and Germany all shattered, and into this devastation walk the politicians and diplomats who will produce the Treaty of Versailles. Now, most of us learned the basics in school. Germany was blamed, made to pay, stripped of territory. But almost everyone underestimates what that treaty actually did, and more importantly, what kind of financial trap it built. Not just for Germany, but for the entire world. Start with the clause that came to be called the War Guilt Clause. In a single paragraph, Germany was forced to accept sole responsibility for causing the war and everything that flowed from it. Historians have argued for a century about how much blame Germany truly deserved, and the honest scholarly consensus is that the causes of the First World War were a tangle of alliances, imperial rivalry, arms races, and catastrophic miscalculation by multiple great powers. But none of that nuance mattered in 1919. The victors wanted someone to pay, and Germany would be that someone. And then came the bill. The Reparations Commission eventually landed on a figure so enormous, running into the hundreds of billions in today's terms, that many economists at the time simply said out loud that it could never be paid. Nobody said it louder than a young British economist on the British delegation named John Maynard Keynes. He sat in those rooms and watched what was being assembled, and he was so appalled that he resigned and went home to write a book about it. That book, on the economic consequences of the peace, became one of the most prophetic works of the century. His argument was straightforward, and in hindsight, devastating. He warned that you cannot squeeze blood from a stone, that trying to extract these astronomical sums from a devastated country would not produce justice. It would produce ruin, and ruin would produce radicalism, and radicalism would eventually produce another war. The book was a bestseller on both sides of the Atlantic. It was read widely, discussed everywhere, and its warnings were almost entirely ignored by the people with the power to change course, because the domestic political pressure to punish Germany was simply too strong to resist. But here is where the story becomes genuinely strange, because Versailles did not only create a problem for Germany. It built a debt trap that snared the winners too. During the war, Britain and France had borrowed enormous sums from the United States to keep fighting. Billions of dollars had flowed from American banks into Allied treasuries, and when the war ended, Washington wanted its money back. These had been loans, not gifts, and America expected repayment. But Britain and France were broke, their economies gutted. The only way they could pay America was by collecting reparations from Germany. So look at the shape of the thing. Germany pays reparations to Britain and France. Britain and France use that money to repay their war debts to America. And if Germany cannot pay, the entire structure collapses, taking the victors down with the vanquished. This was not merely bad economics. It was a time bomb wired directly into the architecture of the post-war world. And Germany could not pay. Not even close. The treaty had stripped away a significant slice of its territory, a large share of its farmland, a quarter of its coal mines, most of its iron production. Its military was gutted, its merchant fleet confiscated, entire industrial regions placed under foreign control. So how, precisely, was this country supposed to generate the massive trade surpluses required to make those payments? It could not, and the failure came fast. By 1922, Germany had fallen behind. France was enraged, because France needed that German money to service its own American debt. So in early 1923, French and Belgian troops marched into Germany's industrial heartland and occupied it, intending to seize the mines and factories and simply take the payments by force. The German government responded with mass passive resistance. Workers went on strike. Production stopped. And to support those striking workers, the German government did the one thing it still could do. It printed money, enormous quantities of it, and that gave the world one of the most spectacular economic collapses ever recorded. At the start of that year, a single American dollar was worth something like 17,000 German marks. By the end of the year, $1 was worth trillions. The currency became, quite literally, worthless paper. People carried cash in wheelbarrows to buy bread. Workers were paid twice a day so they could spend the money before it lost meaning by the afternoon. Savings built over a lifetime evaporated in weeks. Pensioners discovered that their entire retirement could not buy a single meal. And here we have to stop, because the crucial damage was not financial. It was psychological. Hyperinflation did not just destroy wealth, it destroyed trust. It destroyed faith in banks, in government, in democracy, in the basic idea that a society can be relied upon to keep its promises. When your money turns to paper, when everything you built dissolves through no fault of your own, you do not merely become angry. You become desperate. And a desperate person becomes willing to listen to anyone who promises to restore order, to give back their dignity, and to punish whoever is supposedly responsible for their suffering. That is the soil extremism grows in. And in Germany in the early 1920s, that soil was being tilled with extraordinary thoroughness. Now, the conventional history usually jumps straight from here to Hitler's rise. But that skips the middle chapter. And the middle chapter is where the money is. By late 1923, the situation had become so dire that even the victorious powers admitted the system was broken. So an international committee was assembled, headed by an American banker, to restructure Germany's payments and stabilize its economy. The resulting plan, adopted in 1924, reorganized the German central bank, introduced a new stable currency to replace the worthless one, set out a gentler schedule of reparations, and, most importantly of all, opened the floodgates for American loans to pour into Germany. And pour they did. Over the next 5 years, American banks and investors lent Germany billions of dollars. That money flowed into German industry, infrastructure, and government bonds. Cities built new roads and buildings, factories were modernized, the economy boomed. Unemployment fell. For a brief, glittering moment it looked as though the crisis was over and the wound had healed. But almost nobody wants to say the obvious thing about that recovery. It was built entirely on borrowed money, and the money was American. Germany was not generating the wealth to pay its reparations through its own economic strength. It was borrowing from New York to pay Paris and London, who then paid Washington, who then lent it back to Berlin. The money was going in a circle, and the circle only kept turning as long as American investors kept feeding it. This was precisely what Keynes had warned about. The whole structure depended on an endless willingness to lend. If that willingness ever faltered, the entire thing would come down at once. It was a house of cards built on international credit, and the men in charge of it seemed content to admire the view from the top. At the end of the decade, a new plan replaced the old one, named for another American financier, stretching Germany's payments out over decades. And it created a new institution to manage the flow, a bank headquartered in Switzerland, in the city of Basel, a bank for central banks. That institution deserves your attention, because it was chartered with extraordinary immunities, exempt from government interference and from taxation, in peace and in war. It was designed, deliberately, to sit above and beyond the reach of any single nation, in a kind of legal gray zone. And when war eventually came, this bank did not close its doors. It kept right on working, doing business with the central banks of both sides, accepting gold from the Nazis, gold that had been looted from the treasuries of conquered nations, and in some cases taken from the victims of the Holocaust. It even helped transfer the gold reserves of Czechoslovakia into German hands after Germany swallowed that country. Gold the Czechs had specifically moved to London for safekeeping. When an American Treasury Secretary later grew alarmed enough to push for the bank's dissolution at the Great Post-War Financial Conference, a resolution actually passed calling for it to be wound up. It never was. The bank survives to this day, in the same Swiss city, still shielded by the same immunities, its wartime record politely swept under the rug. But hold that thought, because the fuse was lit somewhere else first. By the late 1920s, the entire global order was balanced on American credit. German recovery depended on it. British and French debt repayment depended on it. And global prosperity depended on nations keeping their markets open to one another. Every single one of those dependencies was about to snap in rapid succession. The first domino was the American stock market. In the autumn of 1929, the New York Exchange suffered the most devastating crash in its history. Billions in paper wealth evaporated in days. The crash itself did not cause the Great Depression, but it triggered the chain reaction that did. American banks, suddenly staring at catastrophic losses, began calling in their foreign loans. And guess which country had been borrowing the most? Almost overnight, the flow of capital into Germany reversed and ran backwards. The loans propping up the German economy were being yanked home. German businesses lost their financing. German banks began to fail. Unemployment, which had been falling through the good years, exploded. Within about 3 years, roughly 6 million Germans, a quarter of the workforce, were out of work, and many were on the edge of genuine hunger. And then the second blow landed, the one I opened with, the one almost nobody talks about. In the summer of 1930, the American government raised tariffs on more than 20,000 imported goods. The intention was reasonable enough on its face, to protect American farmers and manufacturers from foreign competition in a crisis. The effect was a global trade war. Country after country retaliated, raising their own barriers. Canada, Britain, France, Germany, all of them. And global trade, which had been the engine of the whole decade's prosperity, simply collapsed. International trade fell by something on the order of 2/3. The world economy, already reeling from the crash, was now being strangled by protectionism. Every nation, acting rationally in its own narrow interest, made the disaster worse for everyone, including itself. Economists have a name for this. They call it a beggar-thy-neighbor policy, and it is exactly what it sounds like. You try to save yourself by pushing your neighbor under the water, and then you both drown. In Germany, the combination was lethal. American loans withdrawn, export markets slammed shut, industrial output in free fall, and a democratic government that now looked utterly helpless to a starving population. In that environment, political extremism did not merely grow. It detonated. From a party dismissed as fringe cranks, the Nazis vaulted to become the second largest party in parliament, and then the largest. And in January of 1933, Hitler was appointed chancellor. Now here is where the conventional story usually picks up, and here is where it leaves out a dimension that makes a lot of people uncomfortable. Because Hitler's Germany did not run on German money alone. The industrial machine that would build the war was deeply, profitably entangled with American and British capital, and had been for years. Start with the man who was the financial architect of it all, Hjalmar Schacht. He was a genuine financial genius who had already saved Germany once, by taming the hyperinflation of 1923. He had run the German central bank. And crucially, he had deep personal ties to the American and British financial establishments. He knew the great Wall Street bankers. He moved easily in those elite circles. In 1930, he resigned his post and began cultivating the German right, including the Nazis, and he became one of the influential figures who pushed the aging German president to appoint Hitler as chancellor. This is a point worth pausing on. Hitler did not seize power in a violent revolution. He was handed it by conservative elites and industrialists who convinced themselves they could use him and control him. They were catastrophically wrong. And once Hitler was in, Schacht was immediately reinstalled at the head of the central bank and made economics minister, where he engineered the financial trickery that funded rearmament. Now, I want to be careful here, because this exact territory is where honest history gets hijacked into something ugly. You will find versions of this story that claim a secret cabal of bankers deliberately created Hitler as an instrument, and those versions almost always slide, sooner or later, into anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, the ancient lie about a hidden hand controlling the world. I am not going to sell you that, because it is false, and because the truth does not need it. There is also a specific, popular book making the rounds on this subject, whose author argued for a deliberate Wall Street plot, and I want to flag that his work is regarded by mainstream historians as unreliable and overreaching. So let me draw the line clearly. There is a vast difference between saying that American corporations and banks knowingly intended to cause a world war and saying that their relentless pursuit of profit created the conditions that made one possible. The evidence overwhelmingly supports the second, not the first. These companies were not plotting to destroy democracy. They were doing what companies do, chasing returns, seeking markets, protecting their competitive positions, and choosing not to look too hard at who they were selling to. The effect, however, was to arm and equip a regime that was openly announcing its intention to conquer. And the effect is what matters, so look at it plainly. Consider the enormous German chemical conglomerate that would eventually manufacture the poison gas used in the extermination camps. It had sweeping cartel agreements with American corporations, most notably with the great American Oil Company descended from the Rockefeller Empire. In 1929, the two of them essentially carved up the world between them, sharing patents, trading technologies, coordinating strategies. Through that partnership, critical technology flowed into Germany, including the process for making synthetic gasoline from coal. Understand why that is so damning. Germany had abundant coal and almost no oil. Without a way to manufacture fuel, its military simply could not have sustained a long war. An American company helped hand it the recipe. Even more pointedly, through a joint venture part owned by that oil company and one of America's largest car makers, Germany received the technology for a fuel additive essential to high-performance aircraft engines. Without it, German fighters and bombers would have been badly handicapped. That transfer went ahead over objections from the United States War Department, which could see exactly what it meant. And the same oil company shared its synthetic rubber technology with its German partner, while at the same time restraining the development of synthetic rubber back home to protect the cartel arrangement. Germany had no natural rubber at all. Tanks need tires, aircraft need seals, vehicles need hoses. That synthetic rubber, made with technology shared by American partners, was indispensable to the German war machine And when America finally needed synthetic rubber for its own military, it found itself years behind. A United States senator later used language close to treason to describe it. Nor was that the only case. An American automaker's plant in Germany produced military trucks for the German army. That company's founder, a notorious anti-Semite whose writings Hitler openly admired, accepted one of the highest honors the Nazi state gave to a foreigner. An American telecommunications giant had interests in a German aircraft manufacturer that built fighter planes. Other American industrial and chemical giants had cartel agreements and affiliates woven into the German economy. The German industrialists who financed Hitler's rise were, to a striking degree, the directors of cartels with American connections. That is not a footnote to the story of how a bankrupt, defeated country transformed itself into the most formidable military power in Europe in under a decade. It is a central feature of it. And Britain's hands are not clean either. The man who ran the Bank of England for an extraordinarily long stretch of this period had close personal relationships with Schacht and the German banking establishment, and even met with Hitler before he became Chancellor. But the more revealing British failure is the one everyone thinks they already understand. Appeasement. The standard picture is one of naive cowardice, well-meaning men who simply did not grasp the monster they were dealing with. And there is truth in that. The trauma of the last war was still raw, the public was desperate to avoid another, and the military was unprepared. But there is an economic dimension to appeasement that gets far too little attention. Britain's financial establishment had enormous investments tangled up in Germany. British banks held German bonds. British companies had German business. A war would not merely be a military catastrophe, it would be a financial one. Every German bond in a British vault would turn to paper. Every investment would be wiped out. The City of London had powerful, concrete reasons to want to avoid a fight with Germany, and those reasons shaped policy in ways that are rarely acknowledged. And here is a bitter irony that closes the loop of this whole story. Remember Keynes and his prophetic book about the injustice of Versailles? That book did its work. It convinced a great many people in Britain that Germany had been treated cruelly and unfairly, and it created a genuine reservoir of guilt in the British public. And Hitler drank from that reservoir. When he tore up the treaty, when he marched troops back into the demilitarized zone, when he annexed Austria, when he demanded a border region of Czechoslovakia, he was able to present each move not as a step toward conquest, but as a reasonable correction of a historical injustice, an injustice that many decent British people already agreed was real. The very warning that might have prevented the catastrophe became one of the tools that enabled it. That is how history actually works. Not through neat villains, but through good intentions curdling in the hands of bad men. So step back and look at the whole picture. What do we see? We see a catastrophe that was manufactured, piece by piece, out of a series of interlocking failures spread across the entire Western world. A peace treaty that built an impossible debt burden and a burning resentment that radicalized a generation. A circular flow of war debts that made the whole financial system inherently unstable. An American lending boom that gave Germany a false prosperity entirely dependent on foreign credit. A crash that yanked that credit away at the worst conceivable moment. A tariff war that strangled global trade, deepened the depression everywhere, and drove desperate people into the arms of extremists. Corporations and banks pursuing profit while arming a regime that was openly announcing its plans. And international financial institutions operating in a moral vacuum, moving looted gold while claiming neutrality. None of this, not one word of it, excuses the crimes of the Nazi regime. Nothing excuses genocide. Nothing excuses aggressive war and the deliberate murder of millions of innocent people. The responsibility for those crimes lies squarely with the men who conceived them, ordered them, and carried them out, and with the society that allowed it. But understanding the whole context is not the same as spreading the blame around until it disappears. It is how we learn to see the warning signs. Because the most dangerous lesson we could take from this war is the simplest one, the comfortable one, that it was caused by a single evil man who hypnotized a nation. That story lets everyone else off the hook. It ignores the role of finance, of corporate greed, of failed economic policy, of leaders who could see the disaster building and looked away because the profits were too good, and the difficult choice was too costly. The real origin of the Second World War is a story about a system, not just a man. It is a story about how debt becomes a weapon, how economic desperation gets harvested by demagogues, and how the institutions we build to keep us stable can, if nobody watches them, become instruments of catastrophe. And the most unsettling thing about it is how familiar it all feels. The crushing debts, the trade wars, the nations retreating behind their walls and trying to save themselves at their neighbors' expense, the concentration of financial power in institutions that answer to almost no one, the willingness of corporations to do business with anyone at all, as long as the contract is lucrative enough. Those patterns did not vanish in 1945. They just changed clothes. The architecture of the post-war world was deliberately redesigned at Bretton Woods in 1944, precisely because the men in that room understood that the old system had failed catastrophically. They built new institutions, a monetary fund, a World Bank, a framework for trade, all specifically designed to prevent the beggar-thy-neighbor spiral that had turned a recession into a depression and a depression into a world war. But institutions are only ever as strong as the political will standing behind them. And that will has been thinning for a long time. So the real question this history poses is not just what happened, or who is to blame. The real question is whether we have actually learned the lesson. And the lesson is not simply that dictators are dangerous, though they certainly are. The lesson is that dictators do not rise in a vacuum. They rise when economic systems fail ordinary people. They rise when financial elites put their quarterly interests ahead of the common good. They rise when international institutions get captured by private power. They rise when political leaders lack the nerve to make a hard decision before it is too late to make an easy one. Keynes saw it coming in 1919 and said so in print. And he was ignored, because the short-term political incentives favored vengeance over prudence. The bankers saw it coming as they kept lending into a system they knew was unsustainable. And they kept lending anyway, because the returns were too good. The executives saw it coming as they kept doing business with a regime that was openly persecuting its own citizens and building an army, and they kept doing business, because the contracts were too rich. Almost everyone who mattered could see it coming, and almost nobody did what was necessary to stop it, not because they lacked the information, but because stopping it would have cost them something today. And the catastrophe was scheduled for tomorrow. That, more than any treaty and more than any dictator, is the true origin of the Second World War. Not a single madman, but a system that failed, and a generation of powerful people who chose not to notice. History is not a morality play with clean heroes and villains. It is a web of cause and consequence, of things done and things left undone. And if we flatten it into a simple fable about one monster, we lose the only thing worth taking from it, which is the ability to recognize the shape of the thing when it starts to form again. The millions who paid the price for that failure have earned the right to have the full story told. If this gave you a new way of seeing history, and how it presses on the world we live in right now, consider subscribing to the channel. We are building a community of people who want to understand the deeper forces at work, not just the tidy version that gets handed down. Drop a comment and tell me what you think. Hit the notification bell so you do not miss the next one. And I will see you there.